Yeah, how soon are you ready to start? Whenever.
Now.
Okay, well then roll up and we'll get you going in like 2 minutes.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
This is Sand Trap Reverse, Stage 4.
Up there?
Yeah.
Wanna go up to the red flag?
Are you guys going 19?
Yeah.
No,
exactly.
20.
Yeah, 20, because it's 19 now. Yeah.
$93,000 miles.
Thanks.
Have a good time now.
Thanks, Dor. Thanks. Go. 30 seconds. Left 5 short, 70. Left 5 plus short, 250. Crest, 150. Turn right 2 plus, soft, 300. So Florida until we get to the right 2 plus. Five, 4, 3, 2, 1, go.
Take the AC off.
Got it. Crest 150, turn right 2 plus soft 300. Smoke crest 250. Left 4 very long, 120.
Didn't get all the sand out.
Yes, I did.
Left
4.
4.
Yes.
Very long.
Yep.
Okay.
Crest 70. Caution right 5 minus over crest. Long. No cut. Slippy. Tighten 4. Open long.
Yeah, you can get out of control down here.
Yeah. Left 4. 120. Right 5 minus. Into left 5 very long, soft, no cut, gear.
This is Hamburger Hill.
Coming up 50. Right 6 over Smone Crest. Yep, that was it. Okay, in Smone Crest, left 5 plus, 100. Left 6 over Smone Crest, 100.
Next.
Right 6 plus over Smone Crest 180. Smone Crest 50. Right 5 at long into Smone Crest 70. Left 5 over Smone Crest extra long 200.
Left what?
Left 5.
Okay.
Smone Crest extra long 200.
It's off camber too.
Smone Crest 120. Right 5 into crest 70. Right 6,
Soft here.
50.
Go.
Left 4 over Smone Crest long 50. Right 5. Left 5 plus into right 5 plus short. Left 5 minus long, 50. Right 4 over Smone Crest very long.
Right 4.
Yes. Left 6 into Smone Crest 100. Right 6, tighten 5 minus over Smone Crest. Caution left 5 plus, tighten 3 plus, no cut, long. Repeat. Caution, left 5 plus, tighten 3 plus, no cut, long. Right 4, small crest, right 5 minus, 50. Right 5 plus, 50. Left 5 over small crest, 50. Right 5 plus over crest long, tighten 4, stay out, soft.
Say again?
Tighten 4, stay out,
Thanks.
soft. 200.
I don't want to stay too far out.
Right 5 plus. Left 5 plus long, 50. Right 6. Left 6, no cut. Right 4 plus long, 50. Left 6 plus over small crest, 100.
Next.
Left 5, small crest into right 5 minus over deep water, extra long. Repeat, right 5 minus over deep water, extra long, 150. Ha. I guess normally it's deep. Extra long, 150. Stay left over crest. Caution, left 6 into left 4 plus over water. Left 6 into left 4 plus over water. Into turn right 2 minus.
Right
Into
2
right
minus.
2 minus.
Okay.
Into left 3 plus long soft. Into right 6, 200. Left 6 plus over small crest soft. Right 6 soft, stay out. 200. Flat long crest 300. Flat crest 300. Right 650. Left 6 300. Keep going. There's your right 650. Left 6 300. Keep going, keep going.
No.
Go, go, go. Flat small crest 150.
Then what?
Turn left 2 minus, narrow tidy.
Before where? Right here.
Here. 300. Right 5 long, 100. Small crest, 150.
Next.
Brake left 2 plus deceptive. Left 2 plus deceptive. It's a turn. Way early.
I know, I see that
Oh,
triangle.
here it is. Somebody blew through it. 180. Left 6 plus over small crest, 120. Small crest into right 6 plus, 150. Left 5 minus short into right 5 plus short, 120. Small crest into left 5 plus, 150. Brake right 3, 150. Caution, small crest, turn left 2. Into small crest 300. Oh, a bit late.
Sorry.
It's okay. 300, finish 350. Done. Good job.
Well done.
Ugh. Hey guys! Thank you. Alright, go ahead. Thanks, guys.